In this video, let's discuss some of the most elementary operations that you need to do in a computer program. We'll use pseudocode to represent these actions. To quickly reiterate, pseudocode is not a real programming language. It is an artificial language that we'll use to learn features of real programming languages so that when you actually begin to learn a language like JavaScript, you'll be able to identify the features easily and define logic well. You cannot execute pseudocode like a real program. So we will just discuss logic and features, and you should use a pen and paper to build your own pseudocode programs. In fact, keep a notebook handy to quickly express logic as pseudocode programs. With that, let's begin with basic operations. In fact, the most basic operation in a computer program is getting data to process. This is often known as an input. And we can get input in a number of ways, such as user interaction using a keyboard or a mouse, or reading data from a file such as Excel spreadsheets, or even obtaining data from an online service. With pseudocode, you can represent the input action in two basic ways. For instance, get the user's name implies that your program will ask the user to enter their name. And remember, variables are little buckets in memory which hold data. So if we say get the user's name as user, we are basically saying ask the user for their name, and when they key in that, store in a variable named user. This will then allow us to get the user's name by simply using the variable name user in our program. Now, in a real programming language like JavaScript, all of this would require a couple of statements. But with pseudocode, you can do away with the programming complexity and just express the logic in the most fundamental manner possible, because right now you need to focus on strengthening your logic as you start to think like a coder. Here's another example where we'll say get the first number as x and get the second number as y. We are asking the user to key in two numbers consecutively and storing them in variables named x and y. We can then make use of these values by using the variable names x and y. Another way to get data for processing is to read data from a file on disk. This can be represented as read data from file mystory.txt as story. In this case, the contents of a file named mystory.txt would be read and stored in a variable named story and can be shown to the user or used as needed. Both get and read are extremely simple ways of expressing input where we are performing a series of actions to obtain data to process in a program. Note how we have capitalized the words get and read, and while this is not mandatory, it is simply part of the guidelines that we are following by California Polytechnic as mentioned in the previous video. Now, with data available as input, we can process it and then we need to show the result back to the user. This would mean displaying the result on the screen or even writing data to a file on disk. In pseudocode, we can display the results on the screen by using either print, show, or even display as keywords to express the action. So now, if we say read data from file mystory.txt as story, followed by display story, we are simply asking the computer to read the contents of a file named mystory.txt and show it to the user on screen. Now that is a computer program expressed in pseudocode. Likewise, in this case, we are asking the user for the name and profession and then displaying a statement that makes use of these two values. Notice how variables start making sense now, right? Every time you use this program, you can have a different set of input values and the same program would work because we have not put actual names and professions in code, but we are using variables to hold values as received from the user. And in this case, we are asking the user for their name and writing it to a file on disk using the write keyword. Simple enough. Alright, so that was input and output, two fundamental things to get started with. Next, let's see how we can create variables and set their values. You've already seen one way when we used read and get, where a new variable would be created and a value assigned. But we also need to set and use variables explicitly. So set x to 20 means we have created a variable named x and set its initial value as 20, which can obviously change over time. We can also say set L to a list of 10 random numbers. This would represent an array holding 10 random numbers. Here's another statement which sets the variable user to the value Michael J as a string. Notice the use of single quotes to enclose this name. Now let's build a small program using pseudocode. Here we are setting a variable named discount to 10. Let's say this value is in percentage. So 10% of the cost of the product. Next, we'll ask the user for the original price or cost of the product and store it in a variable named base cost. We'll then ask the user for the quantity of product purchased, and let's store this in a variable named quantity. Now, let's first compute the discount on one product. This will be done by calculating the savings first. And then we'll compute total cost of one unit by subtracting the savings from the base cost. By this time, your program has the final cost of 1 unit of the product purchased. To get the total cost of the order, we multiply this by the quantity purchased like so. And finally, we can display the result to the user. You can see how easily we are able to express logic with pseudocode without worrying about how this will all work in a real language. Let's do one more activity. This program here computes the volume of a box or a container by asking the user to key in the length, width, and height, and then multiplying the values and displaying the result back to the user. So to summarize, we learned how to express input, output, and we also learned to create and set values to variables using pseudocode. We also saw two basic examples of building programs using pseudocode that accept user input and produce a result.